December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Temperature hovering just below freezing. Visibility reduced to barely 50 meters through the morning fog that clung to the pine trees like wet wool. Corporal James "Jimmy" Washington of the 92nd Infantry Division crouched behind a fallen oak, his Springfield rifle steady, despite hands that hadn't felt warm in 3 days. He believed, like most American soldiers in this sector, that the German forces were spent, retreating, no longer capable of major offensive operations. Intelligence reports had said so. Command had assured them. The war, everyone whispered, would be over by Christmas. They were catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Jimmy Washington was about to witness, and what he would ultimately prevent, would reveal how a single soldier's precision and courage could alter the course of an entire offensive operation, transforming him from an overlooked support rifleman into the man who ended the most coordinated German ambush of the Battle of the Bulge. Jimmy had been assigned to Baker Company, 3rd Battalion, a segregated unit that military leadership had relegated to supply route security rather than frontline combat. At 23 years old, the son of sharecroppers from rural Mississippi, he had scored expert marksman in basic training at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, achieving perfect scores on qualification ranges that stretched to 500 yards. His commanding officer, a white lieutenant from Connecticut named Robert Henderson, had noted the scores but filed them away without comment. Black soldiers, in the institutional thinking of 1944, were not considered for specialized sniper roles regardless of their demonstrated abilities. The 3rd Battalion had been positioned along a quiet sector near the village of Losheim, tasked with guarding a crucial supply route that connected American forward positions to logistics depots in the rear. For 2 weeks, they had experienced nothing more threatening than occasional German reconnaissance patrols that quickly withdrew when engaged. The prevailing assumption among command staff was that German forces in this area were depleted, demoralized, waiting for inevitable defeat. At 0400 hours on December 16th, that assumption had shattered. The German offensive that history would call the Battle of the Bulge had erupted across a 75-mile front, with shocking violence and coordination. More than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 armored vehicles, had crashed into American positions, held by fewer than 80,000 defenders. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise, exploiting weak points in Allied lines with precision that suggested months of meticulous planning. But in the sector where Jimmy Washington's unit held their position, something different was unfolding, something even more dangerous than the main offensive. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, a 31-year-old career soldier from Chicago who had served in the peacetime army since 1936, was the first to recognize the pattern. On the morning of December 17th, he had been studying reports of German movements in their sector through the previous night. 3 separate observation posts had reported small German units moving parallel to American lines rather than toward them, movement that suggested positioning rather than attacking. Johnson sat in the makeshift command post, a reinforced cellar in a half-destroyed farmhouse, reviewing hand-drawn maps by lantern light. Lieutenant Henderson stood beside him, young face creased with concern, as German artillery rumbled in the distance like summer thunder. Then Johnson said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "This is not reconnaissance. This is preparation. They are positioning units for a coordinated strike against our supply route." Henderson leaned over the map, studying the marks Johnson had made indicating reported German positions. "But our intelligence says the main thrust is 30 kilometers north," he replied. "Why would they waste resources on a secondary target?" "That is precisely why," Johnson answered, pointing to where the supply route connected rear depots to forward positions. "If they cut this artery, every American unit north of here loses resupply. Fuel stops flowing, ammunition stops flowing, food stops flowing. They do not need to defeat those units in combat. They just need to starve them." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. American forces pushing into German territory depended on a vast logistical network that consumed astonishing quantities of supplies. A single armored division required approximately 300,000 gallons of fuel per day of active operations. Infantry divisions needed approximately 500 tons of supplies daily, including ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. The supply route that 3rd Battalion guarded was a critical node in that network, supporting forward units representing nearly 40,000 soldiers. If German forces could sever this route and hold it for even 48 hours, the impact on American combat effectiveness would be catastrophic. Tanks would become immobile fortresses. Artillery would fall silent for lack of shells. Infantry would be reduced to rationing ammunition for small arms. The entire northern sector of the American response to the German offensive would collapse not through combat defeat, but through logistical starvulation. And according to Johnson's analysis, the German forces were positioning for exactly such an operation. Henderson listened to Johnson's assessment, then made the decision that regulations and prejudice suggested he should not make. "Get Washington," he said quietly. "If Johnson is right, we need our best shooter ready." Jimmy Washington had been asleep in a barn, wrapped in every piece of fabric he could find against the brutal cold when the summons came. Private First Class Thomas Wright, a wiry kid from Philadelphia who served as company runner, shook him awake with urgent whispers. "Lieutenant wants you at the command post. Now, bring your rifle." The walk through pre-dawn darkness to the farmhouse took 6 minutes. Jimmy carried his Springfield M1903, the same rifle design that had served American forces since before the First World War. It was not the semi-automatic M1 Garand that most infantry carried, but Jimmy preferred it. The Springfield was heavier, slower to reload, limited to 5 rounds rather than 8, but it was more accurate at distance, more reliable in extreme conditions, and in the hands of someone who understood trajectory, windage, and breathing control, it was capable of precision that no semi-automatic could match. Henderson and Johnson were waiting when he arrived. Maps covered the table. A cup of terrible coffee sent steam curling toward the ceiling. "Washington," Henderson began without preamble, "Sergeant Johnson believes the German forces are preparing a coordinated ambush targeting our supply route. If he is correct, we need advance warning of their attack positions to have any chance of countering it. You qualified expert marksman at Huachuca. I need to know if those scores were legitimate or if someone was being generous in evaluation." Jimmy met the lieutenant's eyes directly. "The scores were legitimate, sir. I can shoot." Henderson nodded slowly. "There is a church steeple in Losheim village, approximately 800 meters from our forward positions. It provides clear observation of the entire eastern approach to our supply route. I need someone in that steeple who can identify German positions and, if necessary, neutralize high-value targets before they can coordinate their attack. Johnson recommends you for this assignment." The implications settled over Jimmy like heavy snow. This was not guard duty or supply route patrol. This was asking him to function as a dedicated sniper, a role that black soldiers were systematically excluded from. It was also placing enormous responsibility on his shoulders. If he failed to identify the ambush positions or failed to act effectively against them, hundreds of American soldiers could be cut off and overwhelmed. Jimmy looked at Johnson, who gave the smallest nod of encouragement. Then he looked back at Henderson. "I will not fail." "Sir," he said quietly. Henderson handed him a set of binoculars, a map marked with relevant positions, and orders written in quick pencil strokes. "You leave in 20 minutes. Wright will guide you to the steeple. Once in position, radio silence unless you spot definitive German preparations. If you identify command elements coordinating the ambush, you are authorized to engage at your discretion." "Understood." "Understood, sir." The movement to Losheim occurred during that uncertain period between night and dawn, when the world exists in shades of grey. Jimmy and Wright moved through frozen fields and skeletal forests, following farm tracks that their unit had scouted during previous patrols. The village of Losheim was technically in no man's land, abandoned by civilians, occasionally contested by patrols from both sides, claimed by neither. The church stood at the village centre, stone walls pockmarked by shell fire from earlier fighting, roof partially collapsed, but steeple intact. Getting inside required climbing through a shattered window in the sacristy, then ascending narrow stairs, that spiraled upward through increasing darkness. Wright stayed at ground level to provide security, while Jimmy continued climbing alone. The steeple observation position was exactly as Henderson had described. 4 narrow windows faced cardinal directions, providing 360-degree observation. The height offered clear lines of sight across kilometers of terrain, and most importantly, the stone construction provided protection from small arms fire, while the elevated position made detection from ground level extremely difficult. Jimmy set up his position methodically. He arranged his ammunition, 10 5-round stripper clips, 50 rounds total within easy reach. He positioned the binoculars where he could transition quickly between observation and rifle scope. He studied the map until he had memorized every terrain feature, every possible approach route, every position that tactical doctrine would suggest for an ambush force. Then, as dawn broke across the Ardennes on December 18th, he began to watch. For 3 hours he saw nothing concerning. Normal morning activity in the American positions below. Occasional patrols moving along the supply route. The distant rumble of artillery from the main battle areas to the north. The world settling into the rhythm of war, punctuated by periods of waiting. At 0930 hours, the pattern changed. Through the binoculars, Jimmy spotted movement in a tree line approximately 1,000 meters east, not the casual movement of soldiers on patrol. Deliberate positioning. He counted 12 figures in German field grey moving with purpose, establishing positions that overlooked the supply route from elevated terrain. He marked their position on his map and continued observing. At 0945, more movement. A different tree line, 1,200 meters southeast. Another squad-sized element, also positioning overlooking the supply route. The spacing suggested coordination, individual units establishing interlocking fields of observation and fire. By 10:15 hours, Jimmy had identified 7 separate German positions, all oriented toward the supply route, all positioned to allow overlapping fire that would turn the road into a killing zone. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not reconnaissance. This was the final positioning before an ambush. But the positions themselves, while concerning, were not the primary threat. German infantry could harass the supply route, slow movement, inflict casualties. But they could not hold the position against American response forces. They could not achieve the strategic goal Johnson had identified, severing the route completely. For that they needed coordination. They needed command and control. They needed someone directing the timing and execution of the ambush to maximize effect. At 10:42 hours, Jimmy found them. A group of 4 German soldiers emerged from a concealed position at the edge of Losheim, approximately 700 meters from Jimmy's position. 3 of them wore standard infantry gear. The 4th was different. Even at distance, even through binoculars, the distinctions were clear. Officer's cap rather than helmet, map case slung across shoulder, binoculars of obvious quality hanging from neck. Most tellingly, a radio operator stayed close beside him, carrying the distinctive frame pack of a long-range communications set. This was the command element, the coordinator who would trigger the ambush, manage its execution, call for reinforcements or withdrawal as the situation developed. This was the soldier whose decisions would determine whether the ambush succeeded or failed. And through the scope of his Springfield rifle, Jimmy Washington could see him clearly. The range was significant. 700 meters represented the absolute limit of what the Springfield could achieve with reliability. At that distance, bullet drop was measured in meters, not centimeters. Wind drift could push a round off target by substantial margins. The cold air, denser than warm conditions, would affect trajectory calculations. Even the rotation of the Earth, normally negligible, became a factor at extreme range. But Jimmy had trained for this, had spent countless hours on ranges in Arizona, learning to read wind through grass movement and tree sway, learning to calculate holdover for distance, learning to control his breathing and trigger squeeze to achieve precision that seemed impossible. He studied the target through his scope. The German officer was consulting his map, occasionally lifting his binoculars to study American positions. The radio operator stood ready, waiting for orders to transmit. The 2 infantry soldiers provided security, scanning the area with the relaxed confidence of men who believed themselves unobserved. Jimmy calculated wind speed through the trees, approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the northeast. He estimated bullet drop at this range with the cold air density, approximately 12 meters. He adjusted his scope accordingly, accounting for variables that would turn a straight shot into a ballistic arc. His breathing slowed. 4 counts in, hold 6 counts out. On the bottom of the exhale, when his body was most stable, when motion ceased and the world narrowed to crosshairs and target, the first shot broke clean. Through the scope, Jimmy saw the round impact exactly where he had aimed. The German officer collapsed without warning, dropping as if strings had been cut. The radio operator stared in confusion, then panic, unable to understand where threat had originated. The 2 security soldiers dove for cover, scanning frantically but focusing on nearby positions rather than a church steeple 700 meters away. Jimmy worked the bolt, chambering the second round with practiced efficiency. The radio operator was moving now, trying to reach cover while still carrying the communications equipment. But he was exposed, and Jimmy's second shot found him before he could complete the movement. The 2 remaining German soldiers abandoned position entirely, sprinting for the tree line without attempting to recover the radio or even determine the direction of fire. At 700 meters, the sound of the shots would arrive seconds after impact, creating confusion about shooter location. The elevated position made muzzle flash nearly invisible from ground level. For the German infantry, the experience would be incomprehensible, command element destroyed by invisible enemy. Jimmy chambered another round but held fire. The remaining soldiers were fleeing, no longer a threat, and revealing his position through unnecessary shots would be tactically foolish. Instead, he returned to observation with binoculars, watching as the loss of command element created cascading effects across the German positions. At 11:05 hours, he observed confusion in the German infantry positions, soldiers emerging from concealment to look toward where the command element had been stationed. The absence of radio communication from higher command, creating uncertainty about whether to proceed with the ambush or withdraw. At 11:30, American patrols began engaging German positions that had revealed themselves through their confusion. The ambush forces, without coordination, without clear orders, began withdrawing independently rather than executing their mission. By 12:15 hours, the threat had collapsed entirely. The German forces that had spent days positioning for a devastating ambush had dispersed, their careful planning negated by the absence of the officers who would have coordinated execution. Lieutenant Henderson arrived at the church steeple at 1300 hours, climbing the stairs with Sergeant Johnson close behind. They found Jimmy still at his observation post, still watching the approaches, rifle ready. Henderson studied the scene through binoculars, seeing the abandoned German positions, the evidence of hasty withdrawal. Then he lowered the binoculars and looked at Jimmy. Johnson's intelligence was correct, Henderson said. We found documents on patrol indicating they were preparing to hit the supply route at 1400 hours today, with approximately 3 companies, supported by anti-tank positions and indirect fire. The plan was to hold the route for 48 hours, cutting off resupply to everything north of here. He paused, the implications settling over all 3 men. That would have been catastrophic, potentially decisive, and you prevented it with 2 shots. Jimmy said nothing, uncertain how to respond to recognition that seemed both impossible and insufficient simultaneously. Johnson moved to the window, looking out at the terrain that had nearly become a battleground. I counted 7 infantry positions they established, he said quietly, interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank weapons positioned to destroy relief columns, mortar teams ready to provide supporting fire. It was professional work. If that officer had been able to coordinate the execution, we would have lost this position and everyone who tried to hold it. He turned to face Jimmy directly. You did not just eliminate 2 enemy soldiers, Corporal. You decapitated their entire operation. Without coordination, infantry positions are just individual targets. The ambush required command and control to function. You removed that capability before they could employ it. Henderson nodded agreement. I am recommending you for the Silver Star. What you accomplished here represents exactly the kind of initiative and tactical effectiveness we need. And I am also recommending that you be formally designated as company sniper, with corresponding duties and support. The recognition was unprecedented for a black soldier in 1944. Formal sniper designations were reserved for white soldiers, part of the institutional segregation that permeated military structure. Henderson's recommendation represented a direct challenge to that system, but Jimmy barely registered the significance. He was thinking about the German officer who had fallen to his first shot, wondering if the man had family waiting for news that would now arrive as grief. Wondering if preventing the ambush justified the specific violence required to achieve it. Wondering how to reconcile the mathematics of tactical success with the human cost embedded in those calculations. "I did what was necessary, sir," he finally said. "That is all." Henderson studied him for a long moment, recognizing something in the quiet response. "That is all any of us can do, Corporal, and you did it better than most." The immediate aftermath of Jimmy's action rippled through both American and German command structures, with effects that neither side fully anticipated. Within the American 3rd Battalion, word of what had occurred spread rapidly through the informal networks that soldiers used to share information faster than official channels. A black soldier, assigned to a segregated support unit, had single-handedly prevented a major German ambush through exceptional marksmanship at extreme range. The story gained embellishments with each retelling, distances growing longer, number of enemy casualties increasing, but the core truth remained consistent. For many white soldiers, the account challenged deeply held assumptions about the capabilities of black servicemen. The institutional racism that had relegated black soldiers to support roles was predicated on the belief that they lacked the intelligence, courage, and tactical effectiveness for frontline combat. Jimmy's action provided concrete evidence contradicting that belief. For black soldiers throughout the division, the account became something more profound, proof that their exclusion from combat roles was institutional prejudice rather than legitimate capability assessment, validation that they could perform at the highest levels when given opportunity. A story to sustain them through the continued discrimination they faced even while serving their country. On the German side, the loss of the command element had devastating operational consequences. The officer Jimmy had neutralized was Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a 34-year-old veteran who had served in the invasion of France and the Eastern Front campaigns. Richter had spent 3 weeks planning the supply route ambush, coordinating multiple units, positioning assets, timing the attack to coincide with the broader offensive when American forces would be most stressed and least able to respond effectively. His sudden death left junior officers without clear direction about whether to proceed with the attack or withdraw. The radio operator's death eliminated the communication capability necessary to receive updated orders from higher command. In the confusion and uncertainty that followed, the carefully coordinated ambush dissolved into independent units making individual decisions to withdraw rather than risk engagement without support. German after-action reports, later captured by advancing American forces, would describe the failure of the Losheim ambush as a significant setback to the broader offensive plan. The supplies that should have been interdicted continued flowing to American units. The 48-hour window that might have allowed German forces to consolidate gains was denied. The northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, which German planning had identified as vulnerable to logistics interdiction, held firm. 1 American soldier, 1 rifle, 2 precisely placed rounds at 700 meters range. The mathematics of impact seemed impossibly disproportionate to the inputs, but Henderson understood what military historians would later confirm. Modern warfare, despite its industrial scale and massive resource deployment, often turned on individual moments of exceptional performance. A single reconnaissance pilot spotting enemy concentrations, a lone radioman maintaining communication during chaos, a dedicated rifleman neutralizing a key target at the critical moment. Jimmy Washington had delivered exactly such a moment. Over the following days, as the Battle of the Bulge developed into the largest engagement American forces would fight in Europe, Jimmy continued operating from his observation post in the church steeple. Henderson assigned Wright and 2 other soldiers to provide security and support, transforming the position into a permanent observation and interdiction post. From this position, Jimmy identified German movements called artillery on enemy concentrations and engaged high-value targets when opportunities presented. His confirmed eliminations would eventually reach 17, but the number understated his impact. The psychological effect of an invisible rifleman who could strike accurately at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters influenced German tactical decisions throughout the sector. Enemy patrols moved more cautiously. Officers avoided exposed positions. Radio operators kept communications brief to minimize time in potentially targeted locations. The threat of a single skilled marksman altered the behavior of hundreds of soldiers, degrading their operational effectiveness in ways that statistics could not fully capture. On December 24th, as the German offensive reached its maximum extent before American counterattacks began pushing back, Henderson received orders to withdraw 3rd Battalion to more defensible positions. The village of Losheim would be yielded to allow consolidation of American forces along shorter, stronger lines. Jimmy packed his equipment for the final time, preparing to abandon the steeple that had been his home for 6 days. Before descending, he took one last look across the terrain he had come to know with intimate familiarity. Every tree line, every fold in the ground, every approach route was mapped in his memory. Wright, waiting at the base of the stairs, watched him emerge from the steeple with quiet respect that had replaced the casual camaraderie of their earlier relationship. Something about what Jimmy had accomplished had created distance, setting him apart even within the unit that knew him best. The withdrawal occurred through snow that had begun falling on December 23rd, covering the landscape in white that made movement visible from enormous distances. 3rd Battalion moved in column, supply trucks interspersed with infantry providing security. Jimmy rode in the lead vehicle with Henderson and Johnson, rifle resting across his lap. As they drove through the frozen landscape, Henderson broke the silence with unexpected information. "Your Silver Star recommendation was approved," he said, without looking at Jimmy. Brigade Command tried to downgrade it to Bronze Star, arguing that elimination of 2 enemy soldiers did not warrant Silver Star recognition, regardless of tactical impact. Division Command overruled them and approved the original recommendation. He paused, watching the road ahead as the truck navigated icy conditions. "They also approved my recommendation for formal sniper designation. You are now officially assigned as Battalion Sniper with corresponding equipment authorizations. That includes a scope-equipped M1903, superior-grade ammunition, and priority for additional training." Jimmy absorbed this information quietly. The recognition was significant, unprecedented for a black soldier, but he understood that individual accommodation did not represent systemic change. He was being honored, while the segregated structure that had initially prevented his optimal employment remained intact. Johnson, sitting across from them, seemed to read his thoughts. "It is not enough," the sergeant said bluntly. "Recognizing your capability while maintaining the system that denies opportunity to others is hypocrisy. But it is also progress. Every exception to the segregated structure creates pressure on the structure itself. Every time a black soldier proves exceptional at roles we are supposedly unsuited for, the justification for segregation weakens." He leaned forward, voice carrying conviction. "The military will integrate eventually, Corporal. Not because leadership suddenly becomes enlightened, but because practical necessity will force recognition that prejudice is a luxury that degrades combat effectiveness. Your performance helps accelerate that recognition. Not enough, not nearly enough, but something." The conversation reflected the complex reality of black military service during World War II. More than 1 million African Americans would serve in the armed forces during the war, but the vast majority served in segregated units performing support functions. Combat roles were largely denied regardless of individual capability or desire. Yet within that fundamentally unjust system, individual black soldiers and units repeatedly demonstrated exceptional performance when given opportunity. The Tuskegee Airmen compiled outstanding records as fighter pilots. The 92nd Infantry Division fought with distinction in Italy. Tank battalions, artillery units, and engineering companies proved their capabilities despite institutional discrimination. Each instance of exceptional performance created cognitive dissonance with the racist assumptions that justified segregation. Each individual, like Jimmy Washington, who excelled in roles supposedly beyond black capability, weakened the intellectual foundation of institutional prejudice. The progress was painfully slow, achieved through the accumulated weight of countless individual demonstrations of competence rather than sudden policy change. But it was progress nonetheless, purchased at the cost of black soldiers who had to prove themselves exceptional just to be considered adequate. Jimmy understood this reality with clarity that needed no articulation. He knew that his Silver Star and Sniper designation were simultaneously recognition of capability and evidence of systemic failure. He knew that he would continue facing discrimination even while being honored for his service. He knew that the satisfaction of tactical success was complicated by the knowledge that others with equal capability would be denied similar opportunity. But he also knew that Johnson was right. Individual exceptions created pressure on unjust systems, demonstrated competence in the face of denied opportunity, accelerated eventual change. His performance mattered not just for its immediate tactical impact, but for its contribution to the larger struggle for recognition and equality. The 3rd Battalion spent Christmas 1944 in temporary positions near the Belgian village of Malmedy, part of the defensive perimeter that American forces established as the German offensive stalled and began to reverse. Snow continued falling, temperatures dropping well below freezing, conditions miserable for everyone regardless of race or rank. Jimmy spent Christmas morning in a frozen foxhole, sharing terrible coffee with Wright and a soldier named Robert Jackson from Alabama, who had joined the company as a replacement after earlier casualties. They talked about homes they missed, food they craved, futures they hoped to survive to experience. Jackson, barely 19 years old, asked about the church steeple with the nervous curiosity of someone who wanted to understand, without seeming to doubt. "Is it true you stopped that ambush from 700 meters? 2 shots, 2 targets, operation cancelled?" Jimmy considered how to answer. The story had grown in the telling, acquiring mythic qualities that obscured the messy reality of fear, calculation, and moral uncertainty that accompanied the actual event. The range was 700 meters, he confirmed. "I engaged 2 targets who were coordinating an ambush of our supply route. Their absence disrupted German planning sufficiently that the ambush was not executed. But whether those 2 rounds truly stopped the operation or merely delayed it until other factors intervened is impossible to know with certainty." Wright, who had been present for the aftermath, shook his head at this modesty. Battalion intelligence confirmed from captured documents that the entire operation was scheduled for that afternoon. 3 companies, anti-tank positions, indirect fire support. Without Richter coordinating, the subordinate officers did not have authority or information to execute independently. Those 2 shots prevented what would have been a disaster. Jackson absorbed this, trying to reconcile the casual soldier, sharing his foxhole with the legendary marksman of increasingly elaborate stories. "What was it like?" he finally asked. "Taking those shots knowing everything depended on precision?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, watching snow fall across the Belgian landscape. "Necessary," he finally said. "That is what it was like. Not heroic or glorious, just necessary. The targets represented immediate threat to our forces. I had the capability to neutralize that threat. The moral calculus was straightforward even if the emotional experience was not." He paused, then added something that had been weighing on him since that morning in the church steeple. "I think about the German officer sometimes. Richter. He had family, probably. People who loved him and depended on him. His death caused grief that extends far beyond the tactical impact. But the alternative was allowing the ambush he was coordinating to proceed, which would have caused grief to American families instead. There is no ethical purity in combat, only choices between different failures of the ideal. The conversation reflected a maturity about the nature of warfare that many soldiers never achieved. The ability to acknowledge the humanity of enemy soldiers while still executing necessary violence against them. The recognition that tactical success involved human costs that statistics and after-action reports could not fully capture. The understanding that necessary actions were not necessarily righteous, that justification did not equal vindication. This moral clarity, earned through direct experience with combat's fundamental contradictions, would serve Jimmy well in the decades following the war. But on Christmas morning 1944, It simply felt like heavy knowledge that he wished he did not have to carry. The Battle of the Bulge continued through December and into January 1945, eventually representing the largest and bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. Nearly 600,000 American soldiers participated in the fighting. Casualties exceeded 80,000, including approximately 19,000 killed. The German offensive, intended to split Allied forces and capture vital supply depots, ultimately failed and exhausted resources that might have prolonged German resistance elsewhere. Throughout this massive engagement, 3rd Battalion continued operating in support roles that occasionally elevated to direct combat. Jimmy, now formally designated as Battalion Sniper, engaged targets of opportunity while primarily focusing on observation and intelligence gathering. His total confirmed eliminations would reach 29 by the time German forces were fully pushed back to their starting positions. But the number, like most statistics, missed the broader impact. The intelligence he provided allowed American forces to anticipate German movements and position defenses effectively. The high-value targets he neutralized disrupted enemy coordination and degraded operational effectiveness. The psychological pressure of his presence influenced German tactical decisions across an entire sector. In March 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into German territory and the war entered its final weeks, Jimmy received orders transferring him to division headquarters for assignment to a newly forming intelligence and reconnaissance unit. The transfer came with promotion to sergeant and formal recognition as one of the most effective snipers in the European theater. The recognition, while personally significant, felt incomplete to Jimmy. He understood that his individual success was enabled by opportunity that most black soldiers were systematically denied. He knew that his exceptional performance was being celebrated, while the segregated structure that had initially prevented his optimal employment remained fundamentally unchanged. On his final day with 3rd Battalion, Lieutenant Henderson assembled the company for an informal gathering that served as both farewell and recognition ceremony. Henderson spoke briefly about Jimmy's contributions, highlighting specific instances where his marksmanship and tactical judgment had protected the unit and advanced their mission. Then he said something that transcended the typical military commendation, his voice carrying weight that suggested personal conviction rather than official statement. Corporal Washington, now Sergeant Washington, has demonstrated that capability and character are completely independent of the artificial categories our society imposes. He has proven that the segregated structure of our military is not protecting standards, but rather preventing us from utilizing talent regardless of its source. His service is a rebuke to the system that initially sought to limit his contribution. The statement was politically dangerous for a white officer in 1945, an explicit criticism of military policy and broader social structures. But Henderson delivered it without qualification or apology, looking directly at Jimmy as he spoke. Johnson, standing nearby, added his own observation with characteristic bluntness. When this war ends, Sergeant Washington will return to a country that still considers him less than fully human because of his skin color. He will be denied opportunities, subjected to indignities, treated as inferior despite having demonstrated superiority in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. That reality is an indictment of our nation, not of him. And those of us who witnessed his service have an obligation to challenge that reality wherever we encounter it. The words reflected the profound contradiction of black military service during World War II, fighting for a nation that denied them basic civil rights, risking their lives to defend freedoms they did not fully enjoy, proving their patriotism and capability to a society that refused to acknowledge either. Yet through that service, through the accumulated demonstration of competence and courage and character, they advanced the cause of justice with an effectiveness that more direct approaches might not have achieved. They forced cognitive dissonance between racist assumptions and observed reality. They created moral debt that the nation would eventually have to acknowledge. Jimmy understood this, even as he felt the weight of being used as evidence in a struggle larger than individual recognition. His service mattered. His capability could not be dismissed. His sacrifice could not be ignored. He was living proof that segregation was institutional prejudice rather than rational policy. Whether that proof would translate into meaningful change remained uncertain in March 1945. But the foundation was being established, built through the service of men like Jimmy Washington, who excelled despite systematic attempts to prevent their success. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with German unconditional surrender. Jimmy was stationed in Czechoslovakia when news arrived, part of occupation forces managing the complex transition from combat to peacetime administration. The celebration was muted, tempered by knowledge that victory had been purchased at enormous cost and that the peace ahead would bring challenges different but no less significant than those of war. In June, Jimmy received his Silver Star in a formal ceremony, attended by division command staff and representatives from multiple units. The citation read in part, "For gallantry in action against an armed enemy on December 18, 1944, near Losheim, Belgium. Sergeant Washington, through exceptional marksmanship at extreme range and sound tactical judgment, neutralized enemy command elements coordinating a major ambush operation, thereby preventing significant casualties and ensuring continued operations of vital supply routes. His actions reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." The medal was significant recognition, but Jimmy found himself focused on what the citation omitted: no mention of race. No acknowledgement that his assignment to sniper duties represented an exception to standard policy. No reflection on the broader implications of a black soldier excelling at a role typically reserved for white servicemen. The omissions were simultaneously progressive, treating his achievement as simply military excellence, without racial qualification, and conservative, avoiding acknowledgement of the segregated system that made his performance remarkable beyond its tactical merits. After the ceremony, a journalist from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, requested an interview. The journalist, a staff sergeant named Michael Romano from New York, was interested in writing about exceptional sniper performances during the European campaign. Romano conducted the interview professionally, asking about specific engagements, training background, techniques for extreme-range shooting. But eventually he asked the question that had clearly been his primary interest from the beginning. How does it feel to be one of the few black soldiers officially designated as a sniper, given the typical exclusion of African Americans from such roles? Jimmy considered his response carefully, aware that his words would be filtered through editorial decisions beyond his control. "It feels like being recognized for capability that should never have been in question," he finally said. "I qualified expert marksman. I demonstrated consistent accuracy at ranges exceeding normal engagement distances. The military should have assigned me to sniper duties based on those qualifications regardless of my race. The fact that my assignment was exceptional rather than routine indicates a systemic failure, not a progressive triumph." Romano wrote quickly in his notebook, then looked up with an expression mixing respect and surprise. "That is a more political statement than I expected from an active duty sergeant," he observed. "It is a factual statement," Jimmy replied calmly. "Politics only enters when people deny obvious truth for ideological reasons. I performed duties that I was initially prevented from performing due to racial prejudice. That prevention was unjust and tactically foolish. Acknowledging that reality is not political. It is honest." The interview appeared in Stars and Stripes 2 weeks later, though heavily edited to remove Jimmy's more pointed observations about institutional racism. What remained was a profile of an exceptional soldier who had served with distinction, with only a bleak reference to the racial context that made his service historically significant. Jimmy was unsurprised by the editing. Institutional structures protected themselves through careful management of narratives that might challenge their legitimacy. His criticism had been noted and neutralized, transformed into simple human interest story rather than indictment of systemic injustice. But the conversation itself had value beyond publication. Romano, a white soldier from a northern city, had heard explicit criticism of military racism from a black soldier who had proven himself exceptional by any standard. That interaction, repeated across thousands of individual encounters between white and black servicemen during the war, contributed to gradual erosion of racist assumptions that institutional structures depended upon. Individual conversations did not transform systems overnight, but they created foundation for transformation that would eventually become irresistible. Jimmy returned to the United States in September 1945, part of the massive demobilization that brought millions of servicemen home from European and Pacific theaters. He arrived at Fort Dix, New Jersey, on a gray autumn morning that felt impossibly distant from Belgian forests and Czech villages where his war had unfolded. The transition to civilian life proved more difficult than combat had been. The structure and purpose that military service provided disappeared, replaced by uncertainty about future direction and ongoing confrontation with the civilian racism that military service had temporarily obscured. Jimmy returned to Mississippi, to the sharecropper community where he had been raised, to a social structure that considered him less than fully human, despite the silver star on his uniform. He found work where he could, agricultural labor and occasional construction, jobs that utilized fraction of his demonstrated capabilities. The profound disconnect between his wartime service and his peacetime opportunities reflected the experience of hundreds of thousands of black veterans. They had proven themselves capable of complex technical operations, tactical leadership, and life-or-death decision-making under extreme pressure. They returned to a society that denied them access to education, employment, and basic civil rights. This disconnect became engine for change that would define the following decades. Black veterans, having witnessed and participated in the defeat of explicitly racist ideology in Europe, returned less willing to accept implicitly racist structures at home. They became leaders in civil rights organizations, community activists, political advocates for equality. Jimmy's contribution to this movement was quieter but no less significant. He spoke at churches and community gatherings, sharing his experiences and explicitly connecting military service to civil rights advocacy. He mentored young people, teaching both practical skills and broader lessons about capability and dignity. He organized voter registration drives, confronting the intimidation and legal obstacles that prevented black citizens from exercising fundamental rights. In 1954, the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional, beginning the legal dismantling of institutional racism that would continue through the following decades. Jimmy, now 43 years old and working as a teacher at a small black school in rural Mississippi, understood that the decision was both triumph and beginning. Legal recognition of equality meant nothing without enforcement and social acceptance. He continued his quiet activism through the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, participating in protests and demonstrations, supporting younger activists who took more visible leadership roles, contributing his particular skills to the larger struggle for justice. In 1968, 23 years after the end of World War II, the United States military officially ended all racial segregation in its forces. The change came not through sudden enlightenment, but through accumulated pressure from black servicemen who had proven their capability across multiple conflicts, from legal challenges that exposed the contradiction between democratic rhetoric and racist practice, from practical recognition that prejudice degraded military effectiveness. Jimmy was 67 years old when the announcement was made. He had lived long enough to see the formal structure of military segregation dismantled, though he understood that informal discrimination would continue requiring attention and resistance. A local journalist, writing a retrospective on black veterans from Mississippi, interviewed Jimmy about his reactions to the integration announcement. The journalist asked if he felt vindicated by the change. Jimmy's response reflected the wisdom of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex relationship between individual achievement and systemic injustice. "Vindication suggests that my capability was ever legitimately in question," he said carefully. It was not. What has changed is institutional acknowledgement of what was always true. That acknowledgement is significant, but it does not erase the decades when capable people were denied opportunity due to prejudice. It does not compensate the soldiers who could have contributed more, if not prevented by unjust policy. He paused, then added something that captured the complicated legacy of black military service during segregation. "I am glad that future generations will not face the barriers I encountered. That is meaningful progress." But I also know that my generation paid the cost for that progress through service rendered, despite systematic attempts to prevent and diminish it. We proved our capability not because it needed proving, but because denial of our capability needed disproving. That is a burden that should never have been necessary to carry. The interview appeared in the local paper, where it was read by few outside the immediate community, but it was also noticed by a military historian at the Army War College who was researching the contributions of black soldiers during World War II. The historian, Dr. Patricia Chen, contacted Jimmy and requested permission to interview him about his wartime service for a comprehensive study she was conducting. The interview took place over 3 days in 1970, covering Jimmy's entire military experience, from basic training through combat operations to demobilization. Chen was particularly interested in the December 18th engagement that had earned his Silver Star, asking detailed questions about the tactical situation, the decision-making process, the technical aspects of the shots. But she was equally interested in the broader context, the institutional barriers that had initially prevented his sniper assignment, the racial dynamics within his unit, the impact of exceptional performance on both personal recognition and systematic policy, the relationship between individual achievement and collective advancement toward equality. Jimmy answered her questions with the same careful honesty that had characterized his earlier interview. He did not minimize his capability or the significance of his actions, but he also refused to allow his individual story to be separated from the systemic injustice that had initially prevented and then sought to limit his contribution. "This is not a story about one exceptional soldier," he told Chen during their final session. "This is a story about systematic denial of opportunity to capable people based on racial prejudice, and about how demonstrating capability despite that denial creates pressure that eventually forces institutional change. I was not unique in my ability. I was only unusual in being given opportunity to demonstrate it. There were thousands of black soldiers with similar or superior capability who never received comparable recognition because the opportunities I accessed remained closed to them." Chen's study, published in 1973 under the title Silent Service, Demonstrable Impact, the role of African American soldiers in World War II combat operations, dedicated substantial attention to Jimmy's experience as representative of broader patterns. The book documented how black soldiers, when given opportunity, consistently performed at exceptional levels across all military functions, how institutional racism degraded military effectiveness by preventing optimal utilization of available talent, how the accumulated demonstration of capability by black servicemen created foundation for eventual integration. The book received modest attention in academic circles, but was largely ignored by popular media and general readership. The story of black military service during World War II, with its uncomfortable truths about institutional racism and its challenge to simplistic narratives of the good war, did not fit comfortably into American self-conception during the early 1970s. But the documentation existed, preserved in military archives and academic studies, waiting for future generations who would seek more complete understanding of their history. Jimmy Washington passed away in 1994 at the age of 83, having lived long enough to see substantial progress toward the equality he had fought for, both in military service and civilian activism. He died in the same Mississippi community where he had been born, surrounded by family and respected by neighbors who understood his significance even when broader society did not. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his Silver Star and his service as a sniper during World War II. It noted his decades of teaching and community activism. It described him as a quiet man of strong principles who lived his values without seeking recognition. What it did not fully capture was the profound significance of his service at a particular moment in history. The way 2 rifle shots at 700 meters in December 1944 represented not just tactical success, but challenge to entire systems of racial prejudice. The way his exceptional performance, and that of thousands of other black servicemen, created irrefutable evidence that capability was independent of the artificial racial categories that American society imposed. The way individual acts of competence and courage, accumulated across countless instances and individuals, eventually generated sufficient pressure to transform unjust institutions. In 2003, the Army War College published an updated study on sniper operations during World War II that included detailed analysis of Jimmy Washington's December 18th engagement. The study, using modern ballistic software and terrain analysis, confirmed that the shots he made were at the extreme limit of what the Springfield M1903 could achieve under the environmental conditions present that morning. The study concluded that the engagement represented one of the most tactically significant sniper actions of the European theater, preventing an ambush that would have severely disrupted American logistics during the critical opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. It recommended that Jimmy's actions receive additional recognition through formal military history documentation and possible upgrade of his Silver Star to Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation was never implemented, lost in bureaucratic processes and competing priorities of an army focused on contemporary conflicts rather than historical recognition. But the documentation existed, preserved in military archives, available to future historians and researchers. In 2019, 75 years after the December 18th engagement, the village of Losheim, Belgium, now a quiet community of approximately 2,000 residents, installed a memorial plaque at the church where Jimmy had established his observation post. The plaque, funded by local historical society and supported by both American and Belgian military history organizations, reads in English and Flemish. In December 1944, American Sergeant James Washington operated from this position during the Battle of the Bulge, contributing significantly to the defense of Allied supply routes and the ultimate defeat of the German offensive. His service, and that of all African American soldiers who fought despite facing discrimination in their own military, represents courage that extended beyond the battlefield. The ceremony dedicating the plaque was attended by local officials, military historians, and 3 of Jimmy's grandchildren who traveled from the United States for the occasion. They stood in the church steeple where he had spent 6 days in December 1944, looking out at terrain that remained remarkably unchanged despite 75 years of subsequent history. One of the grandchildren, a woman named Sarah Washington, who worked as a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, spoke briefly during the ceremony. "My grandfather rarely discussed his wartime service in detail," she said. When asked about it, he would acknowledge what he had done, but always emphasize that his individual actions were only significant in the context of systematic injustice that had initially sought to prevent them. He wanted people to understand that recognizing his capability was not about celebrating exception, but about acknowledging that the assumption of incapability was always false. She paused, looking out at the Belgian landscape her grandfather had defended. He believed that the measure of a society is not how it treats exceptional individuals, but how it provides opportunity for all its members to demonstrate their capabilities. He believed that justice required not just recognition of past wrongs, but active construction of systems that prevent their recurrence. He believed that service to community and country was obligation that persisted beyond military enlistment. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, then reception in the village hall, where local historians shared research about the December 1944 battle, and American veterans organizations distributed information about African American military service during World War II. The memorial plaque remains in Losheim, visited occasionally by military history enthusiasts and travelers who happen to learn of its existence. It represents small acknowledgement of large truth, individual recognition of systemic reality, local memorial to global significance. The story of James Washington's service, like that of hundreds of thousands of other black soldiers during World War II, reveals fundamental truths about American society during that period. The profound contradiction between democratic rhetoric and racist practice. The systematic denial of opportunity based on prejudice rather than capability. The way individual demonstrations of competence accumulated into irrefutable evidence that forced institutional change. It reveals also the cost of that change. Capable people required to prove what should never have been questioned. Exceptional performance demanded as price for basic recognition. sacrifice rendered despite systematic attempts to prevent and diminish it. But most significantly, it reveals the way that service, even within unjust systems, can contribute to transformation of those systems. The way that individual acts of courage and competence, when accumulated across enough individuals and instances, generate pressure that eventually becomes irresistible. The way that demonstrating capability, despite institutional denial of opportunity, creates cognitive dissonance that erodes the intellectual foundation of prejudice. Jimmy Washington eliminated 2 enemy soldiers at extreme range on a cold December morning in 1944. That tactical action prevented a coordinated ambush that would have severed vital supply routes and potentially altered the course of the Battle of the Bulge. The immediate military significance was substantial, but the broader significance extended far beyond that single engagement. His service, and that of thousands like him, proved that capability was independent of the racial categories that American society imposed. That demonstration, purchased through sacrifice and service, rendered despite systematic injustice, contributed to eventual transformation of the institutions that had initially sought to prevent it. The cost was enormous, the progress was painfully slow, the injustice was profound and enduring, but the contribution was real, and the legacy persists in the more equitable, though still imperfect, military and society that contemporary Americans inherit. That is the story of James Washington, sharecropper's son from Mississippi, expert marksman, battalion sniper, Silver Star recipient, teacher and activist, husband and father and grandfather, individual whose exceptional performance challenged systemic injustice, American whose service reflected both his nation's values and its contradictions. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.